Here from India. Could I request our speakers and moderator to join us on stage, please? Thank you. Over to you.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this post-lunch session on can the Global South come together to accelerate multilateral development bank reforms? And let me just leave you with two verbs that are used in this title, which is come together and accelerate. My name is Tanu Goyal. I'm a senior fellow at ICRIER, and my organization was involved in the MDB reform agenda set out by the Indian G20 presidency. Pulkit has already mentioned the affiliations of the panelists. We are joined by esteemed panelists, which they are from diverse backgrounds and geographies. So instead of going over again about their affiliation, I'd like to mention that Balazs there is from Hungary, Saeed is from Turkey, Elizabeth is from South Africa, and Professor Bambang is from Indonesia, and today I got to know that Professor Bambang has actually been to all the G20 presidencies that have happened so far. So I think he is the G20 veteran amongst us here. So before we dive into the conversation and come back to the two questions, the two words that I left you with, let me just set a bit of a brief context on some of the recent work that has been done on the MDB reform agenda. Now, while this has been a recurring theme for several G20 presidencies, under the Indian G20 presidency, which marked the first emerging markets troika, a comprehensive plan was laid out for recommending an updated MDB ecosystem to address the challenges of 21st century. And here we must imagine that challenges of 21st century are actually different from different geographies. An independent expert group was established, and it suggested that MDBs should become better, bigger, and more effective. The recommendation touched upon various aspects, from broadening the vision to streamlining operational approaches and even expanding the financing capacity. At the start of the session, the two verbs I left you with, come together and accelerate. Now, what has happened is that in the last 1 year, while there has been it's been more than 1 year since the reform recommendations were made, the progress on these reforms have actually been slow and uneven. In some cases, in fact, there has not been any progress at all. And I think some of the stock-taking exercises, including one done by ICRIER, shows that there is a lot of divergence, there's lack of uniformity in the way the reform process has happened. This is where the Global South, I believe, needs to come together. And in this panel, we intend to cover 3 points. One is, what are the expectations and perspectives from the Global South on the MDB reform agenda? What are some of the challenges and methods of navigating through these challenges, ideas that can come from Global South? And third, how forums such as this can actually contribute to accelerating the MDB reform process. So let me start with a very fundamental point. In the last 1 year or so, there's been a push to expand the vision and mission and incorporate global public goods and transboundary challenges into the whole MDB ecosystem. My first question is to you, Balazs, which is more on the need or on the vision and mission that is laid out for MDBs today. Do you think the MDBs are fit for their purpose from the perspective of Global South?
Thank you, Tanu. Actually, I feel that this panel doesn't happen the first time. I think just a quick note to the audience that we spoke and prepared that much for this panel that I think it was 3 or 5 times more we spoke about the topic than what we have here on stage. So now you will just get the quintessence of our previous talks. And those talks were full of hope to reach big targets. And there was some criticism also, as it's also feelable from your question. But before saying anything concrete, I would like to add one more note that I come from a country where I can use unlimited drinkable water for washing my car. I think this is a very big bias, and I always feel myself even guilty and responsible, and sometimes, ready to be misled when we speak about Global South and sustainability, how to help, how to contribute. These are the limitations also, what I say. I wanted to clarify it at the beginning. So criticism. From this background, I feel development, the term development in multilateral development banks is not valid. It's a bias, it's a misleading term. I believe that three very different scenarios are mixed under the term development. The three scenarios, three protocols, I think we have to distinguish. One, to give, provide, ensure for all human beings on earth the basic standards. If it's done, though how far we are from it, if it's done, then we arrived to the origo, to the 0 point. It's not called development in my eyes to reach to the 0 point. It's also here, I think, a good example can be shared that, many projects focusing on Global South, let's say, fighting against poverty, setting the standards of $1 expenses a day to report good numbers at the end. These projects are focusing on those who are already having 99 cents. It's easy to give, to show up big numbers, to jump above $1 per day. But what about the others? What about the poorest of the poors? Nobody can be left behind. And when we speak about development, I feel many times this aspect is hidden. Another element from the three, so this was the first. The second one, it can be called development, improvement, catch-up process. Though there are questions, catch-up for the average, catch-up for all. These are professional parts, but now to continue the third element, I think development also gives a bias on not speaking about the leapfrog moments. I think in the Global South, there is knowledge, there is capacity, and the infrastructure, the technology is provided to not target only catch-up targets, but to go beyond, to show the next era of development. Many times, I think in history, what we witness is that the periphery or the half periphery shows the next step for humanity. If all these are united and there is more voice given to the Global South, I would just like to, very shortly, not taking the time from you colleagues, say 7 targets that I believe are fundamentally important to reach. One is fair voting system in the MDBs in a structure that fits to the current world economic structure. Clarify the mandates. I think there is time to renew the mandates of the MDBs, including not only opening toward climate terms, but to sustainability in the meaning of SDGs. I think sustainability mandate should be applied. Also, I think there is a lot and urgent to do at the metrics to have comprehensive feedbacks on the impact, reached or not reached. Then the standards of the MDBs should be unified. The administration should be eased a lot from ESG to procurement and many others to catalyze the MDB cooperation between the MDBs, to avoid the one-size-fits-all approach, because there are very important regional differences. And if these are not applied, then even with a loud Global South, we cannot reach, MDBs cannot reach the goals. If there will be more time, I'm happy to speak more about the leapfrog chances, but now I just give the word back to you. Thank you, Tanu.
Thank you, Balaj. I think you've sort of summarized the IG report in a very good way. And you also let out the secret that we've actually had 5 rounds of chit-chat among ourselves on this panel. So, picking from the point that you stressed on, which is the reinforcing the importance of sustainable development goals, let me turn to you now, Professor Bambang, that Do you believe that MDBs today are too occupied with one set of goals, largely environmental related, while the developmental priorities and sustainability is taken in some way a backseat?
Yeah, I like to continue what Balas just mentioned, especially when he emphasized on no one left behind. I think everybody in this room remembers this no one left behind coming from actually our ultimate global goal, which is Sustainable Development Goals. And if you remember the 17 goals in the SDG, 15 of them covering the economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. Goal number 16, as you know, is about justice, about peace, and goal number 17 about partnership. But then, when SDG ratified by the UN in 2015, I believe there is lack of kind of global coordination between the UN itself and the MDBs. As a result, I haven't heard, the management of any MDBs saying that they like to turn their bank from development bank into sustainability bank. Instead, now, if you meet some of the management from MDBs, they will tell you, we would like to transform our institution from a regular development bank into climate bank, which is good. We know that climate change is, very urgent, but don't forget, the spirit of having the MDBs coming after Bretton Woods meeting in which they got the mandate to trying to reduce poverty as much as possible on the face of earth. And I think if we look around and we review what they have done so far, they have been successful. I think, for example, if we look at the last 4 G20 hosts, starting from Indonesia, India, Brazil, and next year, South Africa, we can be part of G20 partly because the support from any development bank that we have been dealing with. So it means that they have done successfully to help our countries at least to elevate from low-income country into middle-income country. And that makes our economy bigger, and now we are part of the G20. But of course, there has to be new paradigm. And this new paradigm should be recorded through the SDG. Don't forget, even though those 4 countries already categorized as middle-income country, and 4 of us already have relatively high GDP in total, but there are still pockets in each of these countries that still needs support in terms of development issue. They still have high poverty. Some of them, they still have maybe problem with the hunger. Some of them, for example, in Indonesia, have problem with stunting. So there are still a lot of development issues that needs to be supported by the MDBs. And don't forget, other than the member of G20, there are still a lot of low-income countries today existing in Global South. It means development issue is still very much relevant, and I think the banks or MDBs should try to balance more, between the idea of supporting the climate financing or climate change, which is very important, but they have to balance it with the needs of more economic and social sustainability that might have higher priority in those low-income countries. So by doing that, then the bank is, in my opinion, it's better if the bank telling everybody, we would like to be the sustainability bank. By saying sustainability, it doesn't mean only environmental sustainability, but also economic and social sustainability, more relevant for the low-income countries. Last but not least, I like to pose a rhetoric question. Do MDBs need emerging market and developing economy more than emerging market and developing economy need MDB. If it was after Bretton Woods, of course, the later one is correct, because at that time, many countries need development banks. But after, as I mentioned, development banks successfully increase the income per capita, the total GDP of this low-income country becoming middle-income country, then I believe it should be the other way around. It is MDBs needs more emerging market and developing economy, because some of the countries already have the capacity at least to top up the capital, to increase the financing ability of the MDB itself. And of course, with the ability to be involved more in the capitalization of the MDBs, then of course there should be more voice and more power for Global South in any of the MDBs. Of course, we might not be the biggest, but at least if we compare, for example, US and India, you know, of course, US has the biggest GDP, their income per capita is very high, but India is getting there. You know, someday the GDP of India will be very close to US. It means India should have more say, China should have more say, Indonesia should have more say, Brazil, South Africa, and others. So by doing that, then the governance in MDB will be more balanced, and MDB will reflect better the needs of developing economy.
Thank you, Professor Bang Bang. I can't agree more with you on two things. One, very soon, hopefully, India's GDP will be close to the US's GDP, and also on the importance that you've sort of reiterated, the importance of sustainable development goals in this entire conversation. So I think it's a good segue to turn to Turkey, the Turkish presidency, and Said sitting here, because it was the Turkish presidency actually which was at the cusp of the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals, and some of the pioneering work under the Turkish presidency actually got SGDs into the MDB reform agenda. So Said, if I may ask you, in your opinion, how has this MDB reform agenda evolved in the more recent years? And what do you think have been some of the remarkable contributions of the Global South in the entire conversation that has happened so far?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to be here. Tanu, thank you for the question. Yes, it started more than a decade ago when I remember when Turkey was presiding, we were talking about the multilateral development banks, sustainability issues. And of course, when you just bring these two issues, how to finance them and how to put them into a streamline. And there have been a lot of ideas since then. And also mainly from the developing countries. Now we call them as Global South or developing economies. I remember after the Indonesian period, these ideas actually intensified, and in the last 4 years, and I believe during the South African term, they will add something more. But the reform process for the multilateral development banks is still going on. So what happened? I remember, and many of you will remember that, many developing countries were asking for money. And money for achieving their development goals. But which goals we are talking about? They should be more in line with the sustainable development goals, of course. I remember the very naive and good initiative by Mia Motley of Barbados Initiative, where they asked for $650 billion of SDR issuance to the developing countries to combat with climate change and to recover from the COVID. It was the years of COVID, of course. Then these ideas, which started for asking money and some more financing, have been taken up by other countries, also in the global north. In the Summit for a New Global Financing Pact, for example, they were talking about reforming the World Bank, the IBRD and IDA mainly. That was important. Then we had some other initiatives, not necessarily linked to MDBs only, but also reforming the international financial mechanisms from the vulnerable countries. Mainly, it was initiated by Ghana and other African countries. That was an important thing that we always forget in our minds, but Accra Marrakesh agenda was also important. That was an initiative from Africa. And then we had the India's initiative. That was for triple agenda, triple mandate, triple financing, and triple funding mechanisms. So it's evolving, but what do they bring? Last year in Indian declaration and this year in Brazilian declaration in Rio, we saw that the countries endorsed the G20 roadmap. For what? For achieving better, bigger, and more effective MDBs. Well, what do we mean by this? Maybe they evolve in their regions, incentive structures, financing mechanisms, operational mechanisms, and financial capacities to make it better, especially the capacities of multilateral development banks with respect to risk-based operations, and project preparation support for the countries, and private capital mobilization, and hedging solutions, especially encouraging the use of local currencies. That's to make them better. And of course, by bigger, we mean we need to increase our financing capacities of the multilateral development banks, and more effective in terms of their maximizing their developmental impact in financing projects. So these were some things, and we had the G20 roadmap finally. Of course, we will see, and we will, and all the developing countries, maybe it's time for South Africa to have a review of what will be done through these reform processes. We are now entering into a new stage, not only reforming or putting the ideas, because there are a lot of commitments going on in terms of increasing the financing capacity, in terms of increasing the technical capacity of multilateral development banks. But I see that we also need to focus on some missing points and flaws. For example, the capital increase by IBRD. They didn't translate into more lending to African countries, for example. The IBRD lending to Africa, in terms of its all financing in the world, was less than 1% only. That's not less. I think that's very much close to your idea that we should not leave anyone behind. And I think in that case, Africa should be better prioritized. And IBRD transfers to IDA also decreased in time, because IDA is much more available for the least developed countries. So capital increases through the IBRD should be tied to some proportional increase also to countries like African countries, the least developed countries. And G20 countries should also, if they give so many promises, they should also double their contributions to IDA and allow the lower and middle income countries for more concessional lending opportunities. If we talk about the financial system reform, we also, in G20, Professor Bambang is a veteran of this, and he knows very well that we also talk about the IMF. But IMF is more on conditionalities. But what we are talking here is more about developmental projects. And I think we still need to go too far, a long way in terms of not only giving commitments. It is becoming more streamlined towards, for example, rather than asking only for money. So what multilateral development banks could do to increase their capacities, to learn more from their experience, and how to get better collaboration with the countries. That was, I think, a viewpoint, note that after Indians idea of this independent group of experts. They provided some recommendations that we can talk about.
Yeah. So thank you. I think you've sort of, again, very well put out what were some of the recommendations that were made by the Indian presidency, and now, Elizabeth, all eyes are on South Africa. So if I may ask you, what is your plan on the MDB reform process? How do you plan to take forward the roadmap that the Brazilians have put out? And how do you think you'll engage further in this discussion?
Great, thanks, thanks, Tan. I think maybe a couple of points by way of introduction. I think the first point is that ever since 1994, when South Africa returned to the international fold, I think we have we've been one of the strong proponents of multilateral, more broadly multilateral reform, but specifically when it comes to the World Bank and the IMF. And so this is something that is very much, I think, in South Africa's DNA. And I think we've had a number of notable officials, senior cabinet ministers who have really driven it over many years, and it included getting an extra seat on the World Bank, and this year, of course, the IMF, which was also a long fight. So that, just by way of introduction, that this is really something that South Africa has focused on for a long time. The second point, of course, is that South Africa has made it quite clear that our plan is really to build on what has gone before us, in the case of Brazil, what has gone before us in the case of India and Indonesia, to consolidate and to continue the agenda. And there, I think, I'm going to make some points specifically about what we want to do with, or what the government wants to plan, the official track plans to do with MDBs. But I think it might also be useful, because you alluded to it right at the beginning, Tanu, is to say that one of the issues that the development working group during the South African presidency is taking very seriously is the concept of global public goods. And it's a contested term. Certainly for some very good reasons, but I think putting it on the agenda and actually beginning a dialogue about how we deal with global public goods and how we finance global public goods, I think is very important, because what we don't want to do, and what we don't want to have, is a situation where the broader transboundary challenges that you spoke about completely overwhelm what the original development mandates of these multilateral development banks. For example, we already see with the African Development Bank, 40% has been sort of allocated to climate. That in itself is not necessarily undevelopmental or anti-developmental, but there are also obviously many other areas that need focus. So I think that's important in terms of the Sherpa track, the development working group. In the finance track, in terms of what has come already out of Brazil, and I think Brazil made really significant progress on laying the roadmap, and the South Africans have emphasized, Treasury has emphasized the importance of reviewing the consistency of standards and requirements across MDBs, across national development banks as well. That's important. We mustn't forget about national development banks when we're trying to find as much capital as we possibly can. And of course the vertical climate and environmental funds, where Brazil also produced, I think, some really excellent, an excellent set of recommendations. And then how does that contribute to the broader efficiency also of the global climate finance system? And there, the issue of adaptation is also very important for South Africa. We have for too long focused on mitigation, and while South Africa may have its own mitigation challenges as a major current emitter, when we talk about the African continent, adaptation is very important, and there we know that the contribution has been very small. Just a point about MDBs, because we focus a lot on the MDBs, and yet there is capacity also to work much more closely with national development banks and to build up those capacities. I mean, I think what's really useful is the Financing Common Summit meeting that will be held in February here in Cape Town. which is about sort of bringing some of those issues to the table. I think NDBs, particularly when you're talking about SDG localization, the NDBs are uniquely positioned to be able to do that because they have so much local knowledge. And so so the interface between MDBs and NDBs is, I think, something that is going to be important. The other one, which is related, and again, it's very much in the climate space, but it speaks to the way in which the debates play out, is what is the financing potential of carbon markets, again, as part of the broader sustainability agenda. The one last point that I want to make there is the issue of the discussions happening in the G20 in a couple of forums, and I think the necessity of making sure that we are integrating and there is coherence here. So there's the conversations happening in the IFA working group, in the International Financial Architecture working group, and in the Sustainable Finance working group. And I think it's important to look at how those correlate. Let me leave it there, and we'll come back.
Sure. I'm also mindful of the time, and we have to keep 15 minutes for Q&A, but we already have sort of breached that time. Janvi, if I'm allowed to just take 2 or 3 more minutes with the panelists, just one more question. So I think what I get from you, Elizabeth, is more about striking that balance. And even when you talk about these two things, as you pointed out, these are not mutually exclusive. There are high degree of complementarities when you look at sustainable development goals and global public goods or transboundary challenges. And somewhere it's about finding the balance and having the funding financing the right goals for different geographies. I know that your institute will also be the T20, will be spearheading the T20 process, and this brings us to the importance of the civil society in such forums, the important role that they play in getting ideas together and bringing out certain solutions for addressing some of the problems. So it's just an open question to the panel, whoever wants to take it. What do you think is the role, how do you think the civil society and think tanks can move together in finding some of the, some solutions to the issues that the Global South is facing today, more through the MDB reform process?
Well, I would add 2 points shortly to this. One is innovation. Innovation, when I mentioned before the leapfrog moments, I would give an insight to a very concrete financial instrument. I think it can improve a lot MDB's efficiency. It's called Green Preferential Capital Requirement Program. It started from academic research just a few years ago. Actually, in Italian, Dutch, UK, and Hungarian samples are proved the green hypothesis, which says if a mortgage is financing an energy efficient buildings, restoration, building, construction, then it has a lower probability of default. If this is existing, if this is true, and it's actually proven by all 4 samples, then a lower interest rate may be applied for such loans, such credits to finance energy efficient improvements of houses or households. If this exists, then I think it can contribute a lot to the sustainability mandate or profile of MDBs. We can go deep to that if somebody is interested. I'm happy to share more. I think this is a very, very good innovation and offering leapfrog for the Global South already. The other very important thing is capacity building. It was touched in the morning, this topic, but I would like to highlight that if the people with university degree know about sustainable finance, I believe it's not enough. The households, the people, the companies, everywhere has to be open for that. And it means that it's not an isolated course, sustainable finance, for those who are studying finance. It must be embedded as a cross-curricular element of education for legal studies, engineering studies, and so on. I really believe that this is the future, and for that we need people who are ready to apply for that, not only professionals at banks, even MDBs.
You would not...
Yeah. I think we have to admit now the climate financing for both mitigation as well as adaptation has been the mainstream of a majority of MDB operation. Then the role of civil society and think tank is how they can fill the gap between, for example, the ideal goal in mitigation through energy transition with the needs of majority low-income country. So, for example, in the energy transition, people start thinking about early retirement of coal-fired power plant. But then, in many low-income countries, they're still struggling with rural electrification because their electrification rate is still very low. So, I think the civil society and think tank needs to remind the MDBs, yes, energy transition is important, but this energy transition has to be in context with the needs of the low-income country in which they still need electrification to rural area. So this kind of thing, I think, will be very crucial for civil society and think tank to keep reminding MDBs. And don't forget, we trying also to support the blended financing for SDGs, including for the climate financing. And then the role of civil society and think tank is to help the MDBs trying to be part of the catalytic financing in order to mobilize more the financing from private and commercial financing. Thank you.
Okay, so let me use a bit of my veto power as the chair, and let me just move to the audience before coming back to the rest of the panelists. So if there are any questions, please feel free to ask. Keep your questions pointed. Refrain from making comments. I'm not saying this myself. There was a guideline that was given to me which said that I must say this. Please don't make comments. Just put your questions, keep them short and pointed. So anybody has any questions for the panel? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much. My name is Sibo Aigbe Oakina. I'm a legal officer with the Central Bank of Nigeria. So my question relates to Multilateral Development Banks. I know there's a requirement, there's a checklist whereby you can assess, for you to be able to assess the funds, right, in terms of adhering to compliance. My question is outside compliance, maybe the funds have been disbursed. Are there any robust mechanism to evaluate and monitor these funds that have been disbursed? Because sometimes we hear that these funds, when they disburse these funds, is being used to pay salaries or used to do any other thing. They are just interested in paying back, but I just want to know whether the funds that have been disbursed out is being used for the actual project or just for any other cost rather than that.
Fair. We can collect one or two more questions, yeah.
Hi, Anit Mukherjee from ORF America. My question to Elizabeth, I'm glad that you raised the question of global public goods. Do you think that the multilateral development banks only consider now climate as the global public good, or they should be also considering other stuff like food security and health and education? Thank you.
Okay. Are there any more questions? I have one that I'm tempted to ask. Yeah.
Deepak Mishra, Career India. I used to work for MDB for 20 years, so I've seen the things from inside. The question I have is, MDBs to some extent are monopoly lenders in their own place. So there are regional development banks who are, regional monopolies, and then you have World Bank, which is like a global monopoly. So until you create real competition for this, MDBs through national development banks and having to compete among each other, there will never be a serious threat to their existence. And so, Professor Bang Bang, some of you have been very closely involved. I have been personally involved in some of the reform work, but you don't see the urgency. So is there a way to create more competition for MDBs so that they start to feel the fire under the chair, so that they start to, because a lot of we are preaching, talking, doing it, and you see it's not really falling into the deaf ear. So any suggestions, ideas for that? Thank you.
Sure. Any more questions?
Good afternoon. My name is Vanshika, and I'm with the Asian Development Bank. So my question is, how do you envision the role of the newer non-legacy MDBs, including AIIB and the NDB, and what, can you throw light on ways in which they can structure themselves more differently and cater to the developing member countries more efficiently and effectively?
All right. So we have 4 questions. One on the use of funds, whether the funds are being used for their purpose. Second is on global public goods. Third, on competition. And I think Vanshika's question was quite close in terms of what is going to be the trajectory for the regional development banks. And my question is just, with South African taking the presidency, the emerging market troika ends as US joins the troika now. There are lots of speculations. What do we expect? So I keep these questions open for the panelists to take one by one. And Said, why don't you go first?
Thank you. I can reply the first question about the projects. I think this is an issue that we should give more attention, because it's not only we get the money, but how do we file the projects and how do we deal with the projects? That requires a big capacity. And in that sense, I see there are national authorities in many countries that help the projects. But of course, there is no unified way of doing this. So we learn from each other's maybe experiences as well. But one thing maybe related to your previous question about think tanks and universities, I think they should be able to provide more consultancy and technical advice for the projects. That could be another potential contribution from the research side, from the universities, if the projects really fits to the ideas and can be financed or should be financed, and also it could be useful for those who file the projects that they can fully utilize in line with the objectives. Because although we have ample amount of money, still we need to use it efficiently, because when we talk about calls for more money, it's very difficult to, it's very easy to have commitments, but very difficult to deliver them. So I think in that sense, we have to make them more efficient. And I think universities are not only public institutions, but universities are important in this sense.
Yeah. So now we have 1 minute each for Elizabeth, Professor Bambang, and Balazs, you to respond. 1 each.
So must I?
So there were 2 questions that were addressed.
Yes, you addressed one and Anit. Right, do you want me to respond?
Yeah.
So on to Anit's question on GPGs, no, I mean, GPGs are not just climate. It can be about pandemics and health and absolutely and food security. The issue here is that you don't want that to erode, or food systems, you don't want that to erode other developmental priorities. So it is about looking at additional financing mechanisms and instruments, and there are some ideas on the table through civil society. And I segue into civil society here and say that it's not just think tanks and universities that can play a role in pushing this, but it's also the more activist part of civil society. A lot of the conversations, a lot of the reforms on the agenda that are moving forward today have been also pushed by civil society activists. And I think that's an important dimension. And I think the linkages between the Think 20 and the C20 can also be very important in that regard. To your question about what we do with the new troika, that is no longer a developing country troika, I think, it is what it is. We have to work together. I think we have to be pragmatic about what can work, and about also how we shape the way in which we want to drive certain things. Clearly, it's going to be a little bit more difficult to push some things, and maybe a little easier to push others. But I think we have to be pragmatic, and we have to keep the train moving. As long as we keep the train moving, we can also pick up things and pick up momentum in subsequent years. And I think that's the history of the MDB reform over the last several years, has been exactly that.
Professor Bambang.
Yeah. there are two types of competitor for MDBs. The first one, I think, the emergence of new multilateral development bank like AIB and New Development Bank, plus all the national development bank or national development financing institution. But then the second one, I think the most, threatening competitor actually is the government itself. I mean, the government that used to be the recipient of the loan from the MDBs, now they are able to raise their own money. For example, in Indonesia, in the past, it was dominated by the loan from the World Bank, from bilateral, but then now, majority of our budget dominated by government bonds. And we have been able to raise the bonds in US dollar, in euro, in yen, also in, of course, in our local currency. It means that the relevance of MDBs should focus on the program. Because if you just trying to offer the financing, then the host country will say, no thank you, we can get our own money. So why don't you go with your own ideas? But if you come with the good programs that really answer the basic needs of the host country or recipient country, then they will welcome it, because that's part of the transformation of their economy.
You want to say? Okay, so the screen in front of me, you guys can't see it. I see there's a red screen that says time's up. But I'm going to take, if you don't mind, no? Not even 30 seconds? Okay, we have to wrap up. Sorry. So the panelists will be available after the session outside. Maybe you can catch a cup of tea with them and have conversations on the other points that they want to make. Thank you so much for being a brilliant audience. I'm just overwhelmed to see so many people join after lunch. Doesn't look like a post-lunch session to me. Thank you so much. Thank you.
My sincere apologies to the panel. We do have to keep the train running on time, but thank you so much for an excellent session. If I could invite you to the top of the stage for a quick photograph, please.